The rain fell hard that night in Buckhead, the kind of rain that makes the air taste like iron and secrets. Thick sheets hammered against the glass roofs of million-dollar mansions, pooling along marble driveways where everything usually gleamed. But on October 21st, at 11:42 p.m., one of those driveways filled with flashing red lights instead. The 911 call came from 1165 Willowbend Drive, a mansion that looked more like a museum of Southern wealth than a home. The voice on the line was a young woman, tight and breathless, but steady enough to sound rehearsed. "My husband's not breathing. Please hurry. He's in the bathtub." When paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, the house was silent except for the storm. Inside the master bathroom, they found Thomas Cross, 43, submerged in a marble tub big enough to fit a small boat. His head tilted back, eyes open to the skylight above as rain pattered against the glass. His wife, Elena, 28, stood nearby in a champagne-colored silk robe, her hair damp, her skin pale. She told him she'd found him like that she tried to pull him out, but the water was too heavy, the tub too deep. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, not even a misplaced towel. Everything was perfect, unnervingly perfect. When the coroner arrived, the only sound left in the house was the low hum of the storm pressing against the windows. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, silent. Her fingers twisted the ribbon of her robe again and again until the paramedic gently took her hand and told her it was time to go. By morning, the headlines in Atlanta read, "Local entrepreneur dies suddenly at home. No foul play suspected." Thomas Cross had been a success story, the son of the powerful banker Richard Cross, but proud of having built his own company from the ground up. He ran a thriving marketing firm and was known for his sharp suits, expensive bourbon, and even sharper charm. He was the kind of man whose obituary could have been written years earlier because the template was already clear: educated, respected, loved. And then there was her. Neighbors said Elena was different, quiet, artistic, elegant in a way that didn't seem learned. She'd grown up in Savannah, raised by an aunt after losing her parents in a car crash. She met Thomas when he hired her as a graphic designer for one of his campaigns. Within months, she went from intern to muse to wife. Their wedding had been the kind that made local society pages swoon. An outdoor ceremony under ancient oaks, white roses lining the aisle, a quartet playing Vivaldi while champagne flowed like promise. To everyone else, they were the modern Southern fairy tale, the handsome heir and the orphan beauty who'd found her way into privilege. But fairy tales have rules, and the Cross family had their own. At the hospital, doctors declared Thomas dead from sudden cardiac arrest. His medical file showed no history of heart problems, no indication of stress beyond what came with success. A toxicology test revealed nothing unusual, except for one faint line near the bottom: trace presence of clonidine, a medication for high blood pressure, sometimes used as a sedative. When the report reached Richard Cross, the patriarch showed no emotion. He simply told the doctors that his son had likely borrowed some of his pills. "A misunderstanding," he said. "Nothing more." But there was one problem. Richard Cross had never been prescribed clonidine. The funeral came 3 days later, under a sky just as gray as the night Thomas died. Mourners gathered in black beneath umbrellas, their whispers swallowed by the sound of rain on caskets. Elena stood near the front, dry-eyed, motionless. When an old neighbor tried to comfort her, she simply nodded and said, "He's at peace now," with a calmness that unsettled even the priest. That night, casserole dishes filled the dining table at the Cross estate, silver trays from neighbors who didn't know what else to do. Cards stacked neatly beside the china. Flowers lined the foyer like a museum of sympathy. And then, 2 days after the funeral, something happened that even Buckhead's gossip mill couldn't digest fast enough. Elena Cross walked into the downtown courthouse wearing the same cream-colored dress she'd worn to the funeral, and she filed for a new marriage license. The groom, Richard Cross, her late husband's father. It took less than 24 hours for the news to detonate across Georgia. Atlanta widow marries father-in-law 2 days after funeral. From daughter-in-law to wife, the Cross family scandal. People said it had to be a mistake. Others said she'd lost her mind. But the documents were public, signed, and notarized. On what should have been her late husband's 45th birthday, Elena walked down the aisle again. This time not in white, but in pale cream, without veil or bouquet. Only Richard's hand gripping hers as two witnesses signed their names. When a local reporter asked him why, Richard smiled stiffly. It's what Thomas would have wanted. Elena is family, and she belongs in this house. The house, the inheritance, the control. By sundown, the story had become legend. And as thunder rolled once more over Buckhead's manicured lawns, one neighbor swore she saw Elena standing in the upstairs window, her silhouette still and straight, staring out through the rain, like a ghost who already knew she would never leave that house alive. The shock didn't take days to spread, it took hours. By the next morning, Buckhead's country clubs, salons, and charity brunches were all whispering the same thing. Did you hear? She married his father. On Monday, Elena Cross, barely 2 days a widow, walked into the Fulton County Courthouse in the same cream dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral. Her hair was pinned tight, her face pale, unreadable. Waiting for her inside was Richard Cross, 65 years old, his posture still military straight, his expression as unflinching as the empire he'd built. They signed the papers quietly. No music, no guests, just two witnesses and a clerk who couldn't keep her hands from trembling. When asked why he wanted the marriage expedited, Richard spoke in the same calm tone that made his bankers trust him and his rivals hate him. It's what Thomas would have wanted, he said. Elena is family, and she belongs in this house. Those words, belongs in this house, would echo through every living room in Atlanta by nightfall. The Atlanta Gazette broke the story first, but within hours it was on national wires. Atlanta widow marries father-in-law 2 days after funeral. From daughter-in-law to wife, the Cross family scandal. Social media lit up with disbelief. Twitter threads spun conspiracy theories. Morning talk shows debated grief madness. Church elders called it sin. Feminists called it control. And the rest of Georgia just called it insane. Meanwhile, behind the iron gates of the Cross estate, the couple refused interviews. The blinds stayed drawn, the guard dogs roamed the grounds, and deliveries arrived by the dozen. Floral arrangements, tabloids, subpoenas. But one woman, journalist Helen Porter, saw something beyond the headlines. She'd spent 20 years writing about Atlanta's quiet corruption, Ponzi schemes, secret affairs, private school cover-ups. She'd learned that the ugliest things in the South don't hide in the shadows. They hide in the light, dressed in pearls, speaking softly. So she started digging. The first thing she noticed was the date. The marriage license had been filed not in Fulton County, where the Cross family lived, but in Cobb County, 40 minutes away, a smaller district where judges signed things without asking too many questions. The document was time-stamped just 36 hours after the funeral. Helen circled that line in red ink. Next, she ordered the official autopsy report for Thomas Cross. Everything looked routine. No blunt trauma, no defensive wounds, no alcohol. But buried in the last paragraph was a footnote that caught her attention. Trace levels of clonidine. She called a contact, Dr. Henry Lowell, the Cross family's longtime physician. He confirmed Richard had never been prescribed clonidine. He's never needed blood pressure meds, Dr. Lowell said. Heart like an ox. Always has been. Helen wrote that down, too. Then she paused, staring at the page, letting the unease crawl up her spine. If he never used it, she whispered, then why did his son have it in his blood? Outside, the whispers grew darker. At St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where the Cross family had worshipped for generations, parishioners gossiped beneath the stained glass. Maybe she wanted the money, or maybe he's always wanted her. That poor boy, rolling in his grave. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Dean, said something that chilled even the reporter who quoted her later. It's not the wedding that bothered me, she said. It's the way she looked at the casket, like she was already planning what came next. By the end of the week, the Cross estate had become Atlanta's most infamous address, a place where wealth met wickedness and where the rain never seemed to stop. Reporters camped outside the gates. The family lawyer issued a statement insisting the marriage was a matter of private healing and mutual grief. But Helen didn't buy that. Grief doesn't look like control. It doesn't move into the same house where a man just died and call it love. She began to ask around former employees, old friends, housekeepers. Most hung up. A few spoke in whispers. One name came up more than once. Rosa Fields, the former maid who'd left suddenly months earlier. When Helen finally tracked her down, Rosa's first words were simple. That house, it's not right. But Rosa wouldn't say more. Not yet. She just told Helen something that would replay in her head for months. Some women marry for love. Some marry for survival. But in that house, sweetheart, there's no difference. As the rain returned that evening, Helen sat at her desk in the dim newsroom light, staring at the photograph pinned to her board. Elena in her cream dress beside the older man she now called husband. Her eyes weren't the eyes of a bride. They were the eyes of someone standing at the edge of a cliff and already knowing what happens when she falls. The Cross estate had always looked like power carved in stone. White columns, black shutters, a wrought iron gate curved into a sea that caught the morning sun. But after the wedding, it became something else entirely, a mausoleum that still breathed. Inside, the air never moved. Curtains stayed drawn even when the sky outside glowed blue. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, a low mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse in time with Richard Cross's footsteps. For Elena, every room felt smaller than the day before. At first, Richard played the part of the grieving husband with uncanny ease. He told friends the house felt too empty, and that having Elena there brought him peace. He poured her tea each morning, walked her through the garden, and told reporters they were healing together. But behind closed doors, the rituals began. He took her phone to protect your privacy, he said. He replaced the car keys with a chauffeur she never met. He changed the locks and said it was for safety. Groceries appeared on the kitchen counter before she could even write a list. Bills disappeared. Friends stopped calling. When she asked about the few remaining staff, he smiled. Too many eyes, sweetheart. Let's keep it simple. Within a month, it was just the two of them. Days blurred into nights. She started noticing small things, objects that moved when she hadn't touched them. Her hairbrush in the fireplace. A single shoe left on the landing. The wedding photo on the mantel turned slightly to the left, as if someone wanted her to see it differently. When she mentioned it, Richard's voice was calm, but edged with warning. You've been through so much. Grief plays tricks. You should rest. He poured her another cup of tea, sweet and faintly metallic. She began to forget things, small at first. Where she put her notebook, what day it was, whether she'd already eaten. Sometimes she woke up in different clothes, unsure how she'd changed. When she told Richard she felt dizzy, he said, "You're exhausted, that's all," and suggested another dose of his vitamins. One night, she found a pill dissolving at the bottom of her teacup. She didn't mention it. She just started pretending to drink. The mansion had 27 rooms, but Elena rarely left the bedroom. She read old books, the kind Richard's late wife Margaret had collected, poetry, etiquette, southern gardening. They smelled faintly of dust and something else, something like perfume trapped between the pages. At 3 a.m., she'd hear the grand piano downstairs. Not a melody, just one key struck again and again, soft and deliberate, until it sank into her skin. She told herself it was wind or the house settling. Anything but him. Weeks passed. On a gray Tuesday morning, she finally slipped into his study while he was tending the garden. The room smelled of cigars and cedar polish. His desk drawers were locked, all except one. Inside, she found a folder labeled in neat handwriting. TC, Final Transition. It was a copy of Thomas's will, dated 2 months before his death. Richard's notes filled the margins. Remind Elena Ree, medical proxy. He's growing suspicious. Ensure filing before Q4. Her breath stilled. At the bottom of the folder was another page, a list of accounts, transfers, and one chilling line written in pencil. The torch passes clean when the flame is contained. She closed the drawer quietly, heart hammering. The house seemed to tilt around her, as if it, too, had been holding its breath. That night, she wrote in a small leather journal she kept hidden inside a hollow candle jar. He doesn't love me. He never did. I'm a portrait he hung beside the others he's erased. If I scream, no one will hear. So I'll whisper instead. She didn't know yet what the whisper would become: evidence, confession, or prayer. But it was the first sound that truly belonged to her in months. As days crawled by, Elena began to perform the version of herself he wanted: silent, graceful, obedient. She learned his moods, when to speak, when to disappear. She waited until he left the room before breathing too deeply. But at night, when the rain returned and thunder rolled across the Atlanta sky, she would lie awake beneath the silk sheets, tracing the cracks in the ceiling. One looked like a branch, another like a crooked smile. She counted 6 of them, and somewhere between the second and the third, she made a promise, not out loud, not even to herself, but to the air that refused to move. You could trap me in your house, Richard, but I'm still here. The neighbors never saw her anymore. The mail piled up, the lights stayed dim. Only once, a delivery driver swore he glimpsed her through an upstairs window, standing perfectly still, her hand pressed to the glass, as if testing whether the outside world was still real. He looked away for a second, and when he looked back, she was gone. By November, Helen Porter couldn't shake the feeling that the Cross case wasn't just scandal, it was rot. The kind that spreads quietly beneath polished floors. She sat in her cluttered newsroom office long after everyone had gone home, lit only by the blue glow of her monitor and the hum of the rain outside. On her desk, the file labeled Cross, Private, had grown thick. Autopsy reports, marriage certificates, property records. Everything pointed to something that didn't make sense: a death too clean, a marriage too quick, and a house that felt like it was swallowing people whole. Still, the evidence was there. She needed something solid, someone who'd been inside. She started with the name that kept surfacing in whispers: Rosa Fields, former housekeeper. The woman had worked for the Cross family for nearly 15 years before resigning 6 months prior to Thomas's death. Helen found her living on the outskirts of Marietta, a small one-story home with a porch full of wind chimes that trembled in the evening breeze. Rosa opened the door just wide enough to see who it was, then sighed when Helen introduced herself. I told the police what I knew, Rosa said. And what was that? Helen asked. That I didn't want to die in that house. Inside, Rosa's living room smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. She spoke softly, like someone who'd learned that sound carried danger. Mr. Cross, he was always polite, she began. But that kind of polite that makes your stomach turn. The kind that hides things. Helen's recorder clicked on. And Mrs. Cross, Elena? Quiet girl. Too quiet. Like she was rehearsing her silence. Never raised her voice, never laughed. I once caught her humming in the kitchen, and when she realized I'd heard, she stopped, like she'd done something wrong. Rosa paused, twisting her hands in her lap. But that wasn't the worst part. It was how he looked at her. Helen leaned forward. How? Like she was an investment he was watching grow. Rosa told her about the nights Richard followed Elena from room to room, about how he'd brush her hair while she washed dishes, about the argument that erupted when Thomas walked in on them. That was the last time I saw him alive, Rosa said, voice trembling. He shouted something about being sick of living in a museum, about his father treating his wife like she was part of the furniture. She glanced toward the window before lowering her voice. And the next morning, the house went quiet. Too quiet, like someone had decided the story was over. Helen closed her notebook slowly. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Rosa, she said gently, do you think Mr. Cross hurt his son? Rosa hesitated, then nodded once. I think he's been hurting people for a long time. That night, Helen went home to her apartment downtown and poured herself a glass of cheap wine. She spread the files across her kitchen table, connecting the threads. 2003. Margaret Cross disappears without a trace. 2022. Thomas Cross dies suddenly in his bathtub. 2023. Elena marries her father-in-law. One man at the center. One pattern repeating. She pulled up old photos from the Atlanta Gazette archive. In a 2001 gala photo, Richard stood with his arm around Margaret. Charming smile, firm grip. But what caught Helen's attention wasn't him. It was the woman standing in the background. Young, name tag, barely visible, Elena, or someone who looked just like her. It didn't make sense. She'd have been a teenager at the time. Maybe a coincidence. Maybe not. Helen's gut told her one thing. This story started long before a body was found in a bathtub. The next day, she drove 2 hours south to Forsyth County to meet a retired detective who'd once worked Margaret Cross's missing person case. Miles Carter was gray-haired now, soft around the edges, but his memory was sharp as glass. When she asked if he remembered the Cross case, he didn't hesitate. "I remember the money," he said, "and how it kept the truth buried." He sipped his coffee, eyes narrowing. "We always thought he did it, Richard, but we never had leverage. Wife goes missing, husband's got connections, story dies." "And the son?" Helen asked. "Good kid," Carter said quietly, but scared, not of losing his mom, of disappointing his dad. That was the difference. That word, scared, lingered in Helen's notebook long after she left. Back in Atlanta, she pinned a single question above her desk, scribbled in red ink. What if this wasn't a marriage? What if it was the final step of a plan? The kind of plan that doesn't start with love or lust, but with ownership. As she stared at the Cross Mansion photo, its white columns glowing faintly against the storm, Helen realized what terrified her most wasn't what had happened there. It was what might still be happening inside. The deeper Helen Porter dug, the clearer it became. Nothing about Elena Cross was coincidence. Not her education, not her job, not even her marriage. Every step of her life had been drawn like a blueprint, and at the center of that design was one man, Richard Cross. Helen's next lead came from a forgotten name in Elena's old university files, Tina Lawson, a college roommate from Savannah State. Helen tracked her down in Augusta, where Tina now worked as a nurse. She agreed to meet at a cafe near the hospital, looking nervous even before the first question. "You were her roommate?" Helen asked. 2 years, until her aunt died. Then she kind of disappeared. Tina sipped her coffee, eyes flicking toward the window. Elena was quiet, not shy exactly, just like she was afraid of taking up too much space. She used to say, "Silence keeps you safe." I thought it was poetic. Helen pressed the recorder button on her phone. Did she ever talk about anyone? A boyfriend, maybe? Tina hesitated. Not a boyfriend. But there was this man she called Mr. G. Helen felt her pulse quicken. Mr. G, yeah. She said he was a mentor. Wealthy. Refined. Said he saw something in her. Called her a quiet brilliance. He'd send her books, art catalogs, poetry collections, always with little handwritten notes. Tina paused, trying to recall one. "You remind me of sunrise I once saw in Florence." That's when she read to me. Sounded romantic, but she swore it wasn't like that. Helen scribbled furiously in her notebook. And this was before she met Thomas? Oh, way before. Maybe a year before she even started that job at Cross and Langley. Helen froze. Wait, Cross and Langley? Richard Cross's firm. Yeah, she got an internship their senior year. Mr. G helped set it up. Said he'd make sure she had a future. That night, Helen broke into a public records search for Cross and Langley's employee archives. After hours of digging through digital dust, she found an internal HR memo dated February 2018, months before Elena's official hire date. Internship approved by executive recommendation, the note read. Candidate shows exceptional potential. Compensation adjusted per mentorship clause. In the margin, someone had scrawled a line in blue pen. He says she's not like the others. She listens. Helen leaned back in her chair. Her stomach turned. It wasn't mentorship. It was recruitment. By dawn, she had pieced together the pattern. 2003. Margaret Cross, Richard's wife, disappears after confiding that her husband was watching the young interns too closely. 2010. Richard begins sponsoring college scholarship programs in Savannah and Augusta. 2015. One recipient, E. Whitmore, later identified as Elena, begins receiving personal correspondence from the Cross Foundation. 2018. She joins his firm. 2021. She marries his son. 2022, his son dies. 2023, she marries Richard. Every piece slid into place like a locked door clicking shut. Later that week, Helen drove to the Cross estate again, parking just beyond the gate where the cameras couldn't see her. The mansion loomed against the gray sky, its columns streaked with rain, its windows dark. Somewhere inside, a young woman was living under the same roof where another had vanished 20 years ago. Helen dialed her contact at the Atlanta Gazette. "It's not a scandal," she said. "It's a system. He didn't fall for her. He built her." Meanwhile, inside those white walls, Elena was beginning to remember things she'd tried to forget. The first time she met Richard had not been at Cross and Langley, as she'd told Thomas. It had been years earlier, a leadership conference where she'd presented her design portfolio to a panel of donors. One of them had asked to see her work afterward, praising her discipline and grace. That man had been Richard Cross. He'd handed her a business card embossed in gold. "You remind me of someone I once knew," he'd said. "Promise me you'll stay in touch." At the time, she thought it was kindness. Now, she knew it was selection. He'd written letters, warm, fatherly at first, then more personal, advice disguised as devotion. "Never raise your voice. The world will listen harder when you whisper. Some people are born to lead. Others are born to be refined." She didn't realize he was teaching her obedience. Back at her desk, Helen drafted the headline she knew would destroy her if she was wrong. The Cross dynasty, a father, a son, and the woman he groomed. She hesitated before hitting save. Stories like this had a way of swallowing the people who told them. But when she looked again at the photograph of Elena standing beside Richard, her posture perfect, her smile hollow, she knew she couldn't walk away. The truth was no longer just in the documents or the whispers. It was in the pattern itself, the repetition of control masquerading as care, of love as ownership. Helen typed her final note of the night. He didn't just ruin her life. He designed it. And somewhere behind those white columns, Elena Cross, the woman the world now called a monster, was finally beginning to see herself for what she truly was, a creation. But not as anymore. The storm returned to Buckhead the night everything changed. Thunder rolled low across the hills, as if the sky itself were clearing its throat before delivering a verdict. Inside the mansion, Elena Cross sat awake in bed, staring at the ceiling cracks she'd memorized, 6 thin lines that reminded her she was still here, still counting. Earlier that day, she'd been dusting the bookshelves in Richard's study, her hands moving on autopilot, when her cloth caught on something wedged behind a row of biographies. An envelope, yellowed, sealed with brittle tape. She pried it open carefully. Inside was a photograph, a younger version of herself, maybe 21, stepping down the front steps of her college library, sunlight spilling over her shoulder. The picture was taken from far away, slightly tilted, as though shot through a car window. On the back, in Richard's neat handwriting, were 3 words. "This one's perfect." The room tilted. She remembered the day, the red scarf she'd worn, the strange sensation that someone was watching her. She told her roommate later it was just college boys being stupid. She'd been wrong. When Richard returned from the garden that afternoon, she was waiting in the hall, the photo clutched tight in her fist. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Which photo?" His smile was polite, practiced. "The one of me at school." "Ah," he said softly, stepping closer. "So you found it. You took it." "Of course. I've always known you were special, Elena. Long before Thomas did." Her throat tightened. "You've been watching me for years." "Guiding," he corrected. "You were lost. I gave you purpose." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. That night she didn't sleep. In the early morning hours she went back to his study, heart hammering. She knew where he hid the key now, taped under the bottom drawer. The desk was an altar to control, manila folders labeled with initials, copies of contracts, handwritten ledgers. One caught her eye, TC Final Transition. Inside was a photocopy of her late husband's will, annotated in Richard's meticulous pen. "Ensure filing before Q4. Remind Elena Ree, medical proxy. He's growing suspicious." And beneath it, a short note that chilled her to the bone. "The torch passes clean when the flame is contained." She understood now. Thomas hadn't drowned by chance. He'd been silenced, just like the wife before him, Margaret, 20 years earlier. She replaced everything exactly as she found it, wiped her fingerprints from the drawer, and closed the study door with a click that sounded final. 3 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning, the 911 call came again from 1165 Willowbend Drive. Male unconscious fall down the stairs. No pulse. When paramedics arrived, Richard Cross lay at the base of the grand staircase, his head resting in a widening pool of blood. Elena sat on the landing above him, motionless, her face blank. The official story was simple: an accident. A man in his 60s, perhaps dizzy from grief, slipped on the antique rug. But the medical examiner saw something the headlines didn't. A broken wrist consistent with being grabbed mid-fall, bruising on the inside of his arm, and, most damning, sedative in his bloodstream, a central nervous system depressant strong enough to make standing difficult, walking nearly impossible. He shouldn't have been able to climb the stairs, let alone fall from them. Detective Miles Carter led the investigation. He'd seen this address before, 2 decades earlier, when Margaret Cross vanished. Standing at the same gate now, he muttered, "History doesn't repeat here. It rots." Elena didn't resist when officers arrived. She walked calmly into the back of the patrol car wearing a beige coat and no expression at all. To the cameras gathered outside, she looked neither guilty nor innocent, just emptied out. At the precinct, Carter kept his tone gentle. "Did you argue that morning?" "We hadn't spoken in days." "Why not?" "Because I told him I was leaving." He leaned forward. Was that a threat or a decision? A decision. She told him about the photograph, the grooming, the years of control. She never said she drugged him. She never said she pushed him. She only said, "He took everything from me. My life, my choices, even my name." By nightfall, word had spread again. Father-in-law dead weeks after wedding. 2 crossmen gone. Talk shows feasted on the story, calling her the widow of Willowbend. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was cleansing the house herself. Detective Carter knew better. He ordered both autopsies, Thomas's and Richard's, retested for synthetic compounds. When the results came back, they revealed a match. The same designer sedative, masked by trace clonidine. Carter stared at the report for a long moment before speaking. "He killed his son," he said quietly, "and maybe his wife." And when his design collapsed, he became his own victim. Outside, rain began again, steady and cold, washing the marble steps where Richard Cross had fallen. Inside the cell, Elena closed her eyes and whispered the same words she'd once written in her secret journal, words that had carried her through the darkness of that house. You can bury a body in silence, but not the truth. And for the first time in a decade, she finally breathed. The Cross mansion was silent now. The security lights flickered over the wrought iron gate, but no one came or went. Inside, police tape fluttered like a yellow ghost across the marble foyer. And yet, the story wasn't finished. Atlanta still wanted blood, or answers. Within weeks, the district attorney's office called for a public inquest into the deaths of Thomas and Richard Cross and the disappearance of Margaret Cross 20 years earlier. It wasn't technically a trial, but it might as well have been. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs reading "Justice for Thomas" and "Free Elena." Reporters whispered about the woman who married her father-in-law, while others whispered something colder, the girl he built. When Elena Cross entered the courtroom, the air changed. She wore no makeup, her dark hair pulled back in a low bun. A simple beige dress, no jewelry. Her hands trembled only once when the bailiff closed the door behind her. To the cameras, she wasn't the predator anymore. She was the question no one could answer. The DA began with Thomas's death. A healthy 43-year-old man, no history of cardiac disease, found dead in his bathtub. Trace amounts of clonidine and a designer sedative, later proven to match the same compound in Richard's blood. Dr. Lowell, the family physician, took the stand. "Mr. Cross was never prescribed clonidine," he said. "Not once in 20 years. Then came the lab reports, spread across a projector for everyone to see. 2 autopsies 20 years apart, one chemical compound linking them both. This wasn't a coincidence, the DA said. It was a legacy. The defense called it circumstantial. They reminded the jury that no one saw Richard poison anyone. No witness. No confession. But the real turning point came when Helen Porter, journalist for the Atlanta Gazette, stepped into the witness box. She wasn't a detective, but she'd done the kind of work most detectives dream about. Helen brought exhibits, dozens of them, copies of Margaret's diaries, emails from the Cross Foundation, and the internal HR memos proving that Elena's career had been orchestrated long before she ever met her husband. Richard Cross was not just a man of influence, Helen told the court. He was an architect of control. Every scholarship, every promotion, every relationship in Elena's life can be traced back to him. She read from one of Margaret's final entries. He watches Ethan like a rival. He accuses me of turning our son against him. He said, "If I can't have loyalty, I'll take obedience." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Helen turned the page. 3 days later, Margaret vanished. She then played the audio clip from her interview with Rosa Fields, the former housekeeper. "That house isn't haunted," Rosa said in the recording. "It's just full of things he didn't bury deep enough." When the playback ended, the judge had to call for silence. Then came the most anticipated moment of all, the testimony of Elena Cross herself. Her voice was soft, but steady, the kind that forces people to lean in. "I met Richard when I was 20, she began. "He wasn't my boss. Not yet. He told me I had potential, that I was different. I believed him. He sent letters, scholarships, promises. When I married Thomas, Richard said it made him proud, that it meant I was truly part of the family. But when Thomas found out the truth, that Richard had known me long before, I think he tried to protect me. The next week, he was gone." She paused, her hands shaking slightly. "After the funeral, Richard told me it was destiny, that I was meant for him now. I didn't fight him. I was too scared. I didn't call the police because I didn't think anyone would believe me." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. "When I found the photograph," she continued, "I realized I had never been chosen. I had been planned." Her eyes flicked toward the evidence screen where the photo glowed. A 20-year-old girl descending library steps, unaware her life had already been claimed. "That was the day I stopped being afraid," she said. "And the day he started." The DA rose for his closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about one murder. It's about a man who believed he could own the women around him, his wife, his son's wife, even his own legacy. We ask that this inquest recognize what should have been known decades ago. Richard Cross killed Margaret Cross. He killed his son, Thomas Cross. And he enslaved Elena Cross through coercion and psychological imprisonment." The judge's gavel echoed like thunder. The verdict: a posthumous indictment of Richard Cross for the murders of Margaret and Thomas Cross, and formal recognition of Elena as a victim of grooming and coercive control. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy exploded. Half the public called it justice. The other half called it a cover-up. Talk shows debated whether Elena had truly been brainwashed or if she'd simply learned to manipulate the master. But inside the quiet hallway beyond the cameras, Helen Porter found Elena standing by a window. "They'll write their own versions," Helen said softly. "They always do," Elena replied. "What will you do now?" "Start over," she said. "Maybe somewhere quiet. Somewhere that doesn't ask questions when a woman walks alone." Helen nodded. "If you ever write it down, make sure they know you survived. I'm not sure that's a story people want to hear. It's the only one that matters." By nightfall, the headlines changed again. "The Cross Dynasty, a house built on silence, finally falls." Helen closed her laptop and looked out over the city skyline. Somewhere beyond those glowing towers, the woman she'd written about was finally free. Though freedom, Helen knew, often looked nothing like peace. And in the file drawer beside her desk, under a label marked "The House Within O Air," she placed one last note. He didn't die from a fall. He died from a lifetime of believing no one could see him for what he was. And she lived because she finally did. By winter, the Cross estate stood empty. The once perfect lawn was overgrown, the shutters hung loose, and the marble steps where Richard Cross had fallen were stained a dull rust that no amount of rain could wash away. The realtors tried to sell it twice, then gave up. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was still alive, that at night the piano played a single note again and again, as if calling someone back. But Elena Cross never returned. She vanished quietly after the inquest, leaving behind no forwarding address, no statements, no interviews. Just a final signature on a release form, declining restitution and estate inheritance. The DA's office mailed her a check for legal compensation. It was never cashed. 3 months later, in a small mountain town in Asheville, North Carolina, a woman named Amelia Ward rented a one-bedroom apartment above a used bookstore called Quiet Pines Books. The owner, an older woman with kind eyes and arthritis in her hands, didn't ask for references. She simply said, "If you love stories, you'll fit right in." Amelia started working there 2 mornings a week. She was punctual, polite, and private. She shelved romance novels and memoirs by women who had lost things: husbands, homes, their sense of safety. She smiled faintly at customers, but never for too long. She wore no makeup, only a soft gray sweater and a small silver bracelet that clicked gently against the counter when she moved her wrist. Engraved on the inside were 2 words, "Still here." The townspeople never asked about her past. Maybe they sensed the boundaries in her voice, the way she spoke just enough to seem warm but never enough to invite more. To them, she was simply Amelia, the quiet woman who lived above the bookstore, who liked to open early and light a single candle before unlocking the door. In the back room, beside a crooked window that looked out over the river, Amelia kept a small notebook. Every morning before work, she wrote 1 page. Just one. She never wrote about Atlanta, or the mansion, or the rain that never stopped. She wrote about now. The woman in the blue coat smiled when she saw the Jane Austen shelf. I smiled back. She asked if I liked Emma. I said yes, but I meant I liked survival stories disguised as romance. She filled the notebook page by page until winter turned to spring. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before closing, she thought she heard footsteps behind her, a trick of memory more than fear. She'd pause, look over her shoulder, and exhale. The past still followed her sometimes, but it no longer had claws. One evening, she stayed late to help the owner organize a new shipment of donated books. Near the bottom of a dusty box, she found a tattered hardcover copy of Southern Living, dated 2002. On the cover, a smiling woman in pearls stood on a veranda, Margaret Cross. The photo had aged, but the eyes were the same. Amelia touched the image gently, then slipped the magazine into the donation bin. Some ghosts, she decided, deserve rest. A few months later, the Atlanta Gazette ran a small update on page 7. Cross Estate sold to developer. Future rehabilitation center planned. The article ended with a simple quote from a city official. A place once known for silence will now become a place for healing. Amelia folded the clipping neatly and tucked it into her journal. Then she turned to a new page and wrote, "Maybe justice isn't loud. Maybe it's the sound of your own breathing when no one can take it away." One rainy afternoon, a padded envelope arrived at Quiet Pines Books, addressed simply to L. Carter, care of Amelia Ward. The return address was smudged, but the handwriting was familiar. Helen Porter. Inside was a first edition copy of The House with no heir, the expose Helen had written about the Cross dynasty. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. "For the one who taught me that survival is its own confession." Amelia read it once, then closed the book and placed it on a high shelf behind the counter, spine facing backward. It wasn't denial. It was closure. That night, she walked down to the river that cut through the edge of town. The water was high from spring rain, and the current whispered against the rocks. She stood there a long time, the cold mist on her face, watching leaves swirl in the dark water. She whispered 3 names: Margaret, Thomas, Elena. For the first time, none of them sounded like ghosts. Back in the bookstore, she made tea, turned off the lights, and sat by the window as thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Her reflection in the glass looked older, softer. Not haunted, just human. She opened her laptop and began to type. Slowly at first, then faster. The story she wrote wasn't about crime or punishment. It wasn't even about Richard Cross. It was about patterns, the way control wears the face of care, the way silence becomes survival. She called the piece The House Without Windows. But when it came time to submit it to a small literary journal, she signed it not as Amelia Ward. She used the name Lynn Carter, a tribute to no one in particular, and to every woman who had once been trapped behind a door that didn't lock from the inside. Months passed. The article found its way into shelters, church basements, therapy offices. People wrote letters to the editor. Some said it saved them. Some said it gave them permission to leave. One morning, Amelia received a letter written in careful, looping handwriting. Dear Miss Carter, I didn't know what was wrong until I read your story. I thought I was the crazy one. But now I see I've just been small for too long. I'm leaving tomorrow. Thank you for reminding me I'm still alive. Love, Jay. Amelia folded the note and slipped it inside her notebook, between pages that smelled faintly of candle wax and ink. She didn't cry. She just smiled, a quiet, private smile that looked almost like peace. When she locked up the store that evening, the silver bracelet on her wrist caught the fading light. The engraving glimmered for just a second before disappearing into shadow. Still here. And for the first time since that night in Buckhead, it didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like freedom.